My name is David Malone. I have the privilege of working at the UN University, which is headquartered in Tokyo, Japan, and which opened its doors here in 1975. Thank you for joining us online, because we have a speaker in Tokyo who will be joined by a large crowd this evening in this city. But the medium allows us to bring to you a flavor of the conversation we'll be having this evening between the two of us and the wider audience also. Our guest this evening is Max Rodenbeck, a long-time resident of Cairo, very much associated with Cairo. He wrote a wonderful history of the city, very fond book, a very deep book also on what Cairo had meant throughout history, but who in his day job was an American journalist who wound up being the bureau chief for The Economist in the Middle East, but always resident in Cairo, but reporting from virtually everywhere in the Middle East. And today, quite recently, earlier this year, moved to India to become the South Asia bureau chief of The Economist. But it's the Middle East we're going to speak about this evening, Max. And you chose as the title, The Paranoid Style in the Middle East. So tell us a bit about this notion of the paranoid style and why it's well suited to the Middle East.
Well, I was just inspired to that because after nearly 20, 30 years of working as a journalist in the Middle East, it's you know, of course, this has been a period of turmoil, but the Middle East has been in turmoil for a very long time. But I mean, having lived through various wars, revolutions, uprisings, Arab Spring, and so on and so forth, there have been so many calamities that one has, you know, just been a witness to for various reasons. And a kind of recurring theme, I was trying to understand why. Why is the Middle East so accident-prone? And you know, so that you have a very accident-prone place on the one side, and another thing that one notices in the Middle East is how common conspiracy theories are. I mean, this is the world center of the conspiracy industry, and it's astonishing the kinds of things that people believe and cling to such beliefs often despite a lot of evidence. So these two things, being very accident-prone and being very prone to conspiracy theories. Well, you know, you sort of wonder, I mean, what the kind of political mix this creates is often, you know, crashes that occur because people misapprehend things. I mean, and this is what I mean by the paranoid, you know, style in the Middle East. So often one has seen that, you know, wars or difficult situations. You take the war in Syria, for example, the current war in Syria. You know, how did this get so bad? You know, it started off as a little uprising, just like it was happening in many other Middle Eastern countries. You know, and of course the Arab Spring, there are different fates in different countries, but the worst outcome of all of these ones has been in Syria. And you know, if we take the Syrian example, I mean, in a way, one of the reasons Syria has gotten so bad is that the response by the Syrian government to this uprising was really extreme. I mean, it was ultra brutality. It was the way that they clamped down on this. And by creating this ultra brutality, they got a response that was equally brutal, and the whole thing has kind of evolved unhappily. But it's interesting if you sort of go back to the origin. So why did the Syrian government, you know, respond with such brutality? And one reason is because they were anticipating a kind of uprising that would have been very threatening to the people in charge of the Syrian government. I mean, they were actually worried about their own sect, worried about their own, you know, a particular social group, and therefore their response was absolutely savage because they had anticipated something. They thought they were facing a kind of enemy that, in fact, they weren't. They were actually facing students and people, you know, marching on the streets. But they thought they were facing a vast conspiracy backed by international powers, and that was determined to eradicate them. You That's perhaps it's not the best example, but that's an example of the kind of overreaction and over-anticipation that one sees in the Middle East, where people are just, perhaps by experience and so on, they just have a rather bleak outlook on the other, and are expecting the worst of the other, and therefore tend to overreact, and then things get worse because they've misapprehended the nature of the threat.
When I first, as an adult, went to live in the Middle East in 1976, I came to Cairo, where I was for 4 years. Nasser had not long been dead, this great figure of the Arab nationalist movement, who had thrived on notions of Arab unity. He had created a united Arab republic twice, slightly different republic. He lived and breathed this notion of Arab unity, but even 5 years after his death, it was obvious that there was nothing less united anywhere than the Arab world. And is this also because people fear always that they're being plotted against?
Partly, I think that does explain it, yes. I mean, there's been always expecting the worst of your interlocutor, in some ways, though, the Arab unity dream was always doomed, because in many ways, there isn't that much that unites the Arab world. I mean, people in Morocco are very, very different from people in Iraq. I mean, it's a vast sort of geographical expanse. And sure, they share language and religion and so on and so forth, and there's a cultural affinity, but they're actually very, very different. So it was doomed in many ways. But it's true, if you look at the things that what actually unraveled Arab unity, which was it was an idea that captured the broad imagination of the Arab public. But definitely paranoia is one of them, the paranoia of leaders. And actually Nasser himself helped to undermine things. I mean, even at the same time as Nasser was inspiring people with notions of Arab unity, his army was engaged in a sort of Vietnam-like war in Yemen. He was locked in a sort of Arab Cold War with monarchies, particularly Saudi Arabia, who were terrified of this new military-style regime. Right at its origins, there was conflict, and of course the Saudis thought of Nasser as being a mortal threat to themselves, and so they backed every kind of opponent to Nasser, including the Muslim Brotherhood, for example. And I think there was perhaps the Saudis exaggerated the extent to which Nasser was a threat to them. And their backing for a lot of the people against him has actually ended up being one of the big causes of the problems we have now. I mean, backing for various Islamist forces all over the world is one they're not, they're the forebears of various strands that have ended up creating things like Al-Qaeda and ISIS, actually.
Indeed. Now, back in those days, it was widely argued in Arab circles that the big problem of the Arab Middle East was Israel, that it was all Israel's fault somehow. And there's no doubt that as Israel's insertion into the Middle East persisted, Arab resistance was very strong for a time, and up to a point a unifying factor, but ultimately turned out to be largely irrelevant to subsequent developments. And I wanted to ask you how you interpret all of that.
That's very true. There's so many levels to the Arab-Israeli conflict, but on one level, of course, Israel was very useful to regimes attempting to keep control of their own people, to have this enemy, this alien force, and so on and so forth. And particularly the states on the borders of Israel, their governments always found Israel a useful thing. But it sort of works mutually as well. I mean, the Israelis too have found it useful to have enemies. In terms of Israeli internal politics, to have this great bogey. So it was there was a utility on the Israeli side of talking up the danger of the menace represented by the surrounding countries, which has turned out to be rather shallow also. I mean, that wasn't true as well. And in some respects, Israel, rather like its Arab neighbors, has kind of created the enemies that it needs. By being excessively paranoid, has created the kind of enemies that weren't there before. And then if you look at how the sort of Palestinian resistance to Israel evolved over time, it became after the first Intifada much more radical. You didn't have suicide bombings until there was the suppression of the first Intifada, and there was a kind of there's a kind of dynamic there in which Israel's frequent over-response to provocations ended up creating the kind of enemy that Israel thought it had before it responded, by making people so angry. So I don't know if I've addressed your question exactly, but
well, a couple of years later, a few years later, I represented my country to the historic leadership of the Palestinian movement, many of whom were personally very impressive. Even at the time, it was obvious that while the Palestinian cause was a huge rallying cry in the Arab world, very little practically was done to support the Palestinian leadership. So again, a sense of a two-level game,
yes,
at which the rhetoric was very strong and indeed convincing on its own terms,
yes,
but all that should have or could have followed from it failed to follow.
That's quite true. Yeah. Well, I think the fact that all politics is local is true of the Arab world as well as anywhere else. I mean, it was always convenient to play up to the Palestinian cause for local consumption, and then what you actually did for the Palestinian cause was quite something different. So that's a sad fact. And as you say, I mean, as things have played out, I mean, the Palestinian cause has been more or less forgotten in the last 10 years. I mean, I think as a result of the Arab Spring, in nearly every Arab country has become much more internally focused, and sort of no one is interested anymore. It's rather sad. The Palestinians find themselves with no support from anyone, actually.
Indeed. Now, today, you mentioned Syria. Syria, in a way, crystallizes how the Middle East creates odd bedfellows, because we have, on the one hand, Iran, a Shiite theocratic government with, very significant civilian components. Syria, in theory, an old-fashioned socialist dictatorship of the people, so to speak. We have Hezbollah in Lebanon, and we have sundry other friends as well of this group of actors. And then ranged against them, we have other actors in the Middle East who are in some ways equally unlikely bedfellows as well, with the sense that the region as a whole is falling apart.
I think it's very true. I mean, one of the constants in the Middle East, and one of the reasons why it's such a messy and turbulent place and has been for the last 70 years. I mean, this has not always been the case in history, by the way. I mean, before this sort of post-World War II period, the Middle East was relatively calm for quite long periods of time. It's actually a result of weakness. I mean, it's because the Middle East is weak that you get everyone sticking their fingers into these things, and it's because these polities, particular countries, are rather weak countries that that everyone sticks a finger into these things. This isn't the first time. If you look back to, for example, the Lebanese civil war, a smaller country than Syria, but it had an equal number of very peculiar bedfellows and different players and all kinds of different people sticking their fingers into it, and proxy fights between various people, and some of the same players who are active now in Syria, by the way. Syria is a catastrophic example of that kind of thing. And I think in Syria, another reason why it's particularly catastrophic is that it took place in the context of the relative American withdrawal from a fairly dominant role in the Middle East. And so there's no question there was a vacuum created by this relinquishing of America's dominant role, which one can argue whether or not America should have been involved in the first place. That's another question. But in moving out of the Middle East, which is one of the things that the Obama administration appeared determined to do, which is for understandable reasons, and it's not it should not be criticized for wanting to get out of the Middle East after the Iraq episode. But it certainly created a vacuum, which allowed other forces to come in, and this has been catastrophic for Syria.
And again, it sort of highlights the frenzy, in a way, of the conspiracy theorists, who for a long time, if they weren't busy blaming Israel for everything, were busy blaming excessive United States involvement, real or perceived, for nearly everything that went on with the region, in the region. Now one senses huge anxiety that the US seems quite determinedly to be withdrawing, because although one of the candidates in the presidential election is more of a hawk than the other, neither of them are making a strong case for greater involvement in the Middle East. Far from it, it seems to me.
I think you're quite right. I think there seems to be there's definitely a long-term trend for the United States to relinquish its role, and which is natural. I mean, it's kind of normal for having getting its fingers burned from overextending itself, but also to just the relative weight of the U.S. in world affairs. So that's not surprising in the least, I think. Yeah.
It's also a region very distant from the United States, which was critical for its oil production for the longest time, but increasingly irrelevant now in spite of its oil production.
Right, exactly. Particularly since the sort of fracking revolution in the U.S. has made America independent in terms of energy supplies.
Now, I'd like to come back to one point as we're at the UN University. One very useful initiative within the UN in my lifetime was initiated by an impressive Jordanian woman, Rima Khalaf Huneidi, who today is head of the Economic and Social Commission for West Asia. And that was the Arab Human Development Report, and it was a sort of unsentimental, fierce, I'd say, analysis of the failures of human development in the Arab world. And it had the advantage, counter the conspiracy theorists, of being written entirely by Arabs themselves, which was impressive in and of its own terms. And I wanted to ask you, in conclusion of our exchange now, what your analysis is of this remarkable failure on both the human health, but particularly the education fronts in the Arab world, where nevertheless a great deal of money circulated in recent decades.
No, absolutely, you're quite right. And that whole experiment with the Human Development Report was quite interesting, because it was an attempt it was a direct clash against the conspiracy theorists, by trying to say, look, these are the facts, and who's responsible for them. Yeah, and absolutely, one of and of course there was this series of books put out. They produced these annual reports for 6 years, and then finally governments got fed up with this sort of criticism and managed to smother the thing. And it's interesting that a lot of the things that were pointed out in these reports were exactly the issues that were taken up during the Arab Spring. Yeah, and one of these is, sure, absolutely, education. It's been a colossal failure of the elites across the Arab world, I think, to sort of pull up their people. It's not just that in terms of kind of international scores that these education systems score really badly in terms of comparison with other countries. But there has been a real failure to sort of make citizens of people through public education. And I think there's a lot of questions to be answered, and it's not just in public schools and so on and so forth, where you see children learning by rote, just very poor standards of learning. But even in higher education as well, there's a really you seem to have elites that are just determined to prevent questioning. I mean. which is, it's been crippling, I think, for the Arab world in a sense. And in a way, that's what underlies the rigidity of a lot of these political systems that have not evolved, and therefore they've become brittle and have become shaky. Is that they've remained very paternalistic and patriarchal, and are not ready to accept questioning, either by the public or intellectually even. So.
Now, personally, I've always been very fond of the 4 or 5 countries in the Middle East I was fortunate to live in, because the people were so warm, they were so generous at the personal level, and it's a very welcoming environment for others to meet up with. So, putting on an optimistic lens and looking into the future, how do you think the region can find its footing again?
I'm afraid it's going to take a long time, actually. I mean, one of the reasons why I've left the Middle East and am now based in India is because it just got very sad. So it would be nice to end on a positive note, but it's difficult to see right now, to tell the truth. I think we've just gone through a really rough period, and one perhaps just has to think long term. And I can remember during the Arab Spring, one kept looking for a sort of, what is this like? What is this whole thing like? And it seemed that the thing that it was most like was revolutionary movements in a place in Europe, for example, in the middle of the 19th century, because which spread all across the continent of Europe, like as if by some kind of infection, a virus. It felt like that in the Middle East in 2011 during the Arab Spring. Now, most of these movements have been crushed and so on and so forth, but they've been crushed temporarily, and who knows what may happen down the line. And one suspects that perhaps like Europe, where the revolutions and uprisings of 1848 were all crushed, almost all of them, and these were revolutions all across Europe, that then if you look 30 years later, suddenly you have reform all across the continent, reform in labor laws, reform, democratization, liberalization of various kinds. There's a tremendous change that happens in the next 30 years, but it's evolutionary rather than revolutionary change. And that's what one would hope might happen in the Middle East in the coming phase. But it's going to be rather messy, I'm afraid.
Great, Max. Thank you very much for being with us this evening. Thank you for being with us online, and I hope one day you'll be through Tokyo and you'll join us one evening for the Public Conversation series here at UNU, which aims to bring a variety of global perspectives to bear on our own community within the university and others in Tokyo.